Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Fanagrassi. I am Director of Alumni Engagement and Development here at SMFA. Welcome to today's rescheduled alumni panel discussion from the As the World Burns exhibition that was here last spring. We are so excited to partner with Tufts University Art Galleries to bring you this conversation. And whether you're a recent alum or it's been a while since you've been back, we are working hard to continue to expand our offerings of events like this to our alumni group. Anything from a studio visit to sharing an update on an alumni exhibition opening, grant opportunities, or events in New York and LA and other locations. My team's whole goal is to connect you with each other, and create a vibrant ecosystem of SMFA artists around the world. So hopefully you're already getting our newsletter, you're already watching us on Instagram. If not, drop us an email, we'll make sure you're getting the information. But for today, I'd like to say thank you to Jackson Davidow for moderating. Thank you, Avram, Gail, and Shellburne for being willing to share your stories and for your participation in this amazing conversation. And especially to Laurel and the TUAG team. Thank you so much for everything you've done to make today's event possible. So now I'm going to hand it over to Laurel for the official introductions and to get us started with today's conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm just going to take a moment to spotlight myself if I can. Let's see. There we go. And we'll use this for the speaker view moving forward. For those that want to more clearly see the speakers, if you can't see me spotlighted, you can go to the speaker view and choose that option. But again, Kelly, I thank you for your introduction. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this online program, as Kelly mentioned, co-hosted by the School of the Museum of Fine Arts Office of Development and Alumni Engagement and Tufts University Art Galleries, or TUAG as we call it. I am Laurel McLaughlin, a curator at TUAG and the director of the Collective Futures Fund, which is a grant-making arm of the Andy Warhol Foundation. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all to our program this evening, Fostering Queer Community at SMFA, with artist panelists Gail Thacker, Avram Finkelstein, and Shellburne Thurber. And this is moderated by guest curator of our wonderful exhibition, As the World Burns, Jackson Davidow. I'd like to begin by thanking our artist and guest curator for joining us and sharing their work from the exhibition at TUAG with us this past spring, and also for sharing their work with us today, since it will cover kind of a broad swath of time. I'd also like to thank wonderful colleagues in the Office of Development and Alumni Engagement, Kelly, Kara, and Alyssa, who join us here. Thank you for your work with us. And also thank you to colleagues David Thacker, Mira Chauhan, and Fee Day for working on this program and rescheduling it with us. And before I share more context for our conversation this afternoon, I want to note just a few logistics for the program today. First, we are recording the panel. So if you prefer not to appear on camera, please feel free to turn off your personal camera using the button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Secondly, this program is a Zoom meeting intended to provide a bit more intimacy than a webinar, wherein the speakers actually can't see the audience. So please keep yourself on mute throughout the program until the end, when we'll have a Q&A portion. You are welcome to keep your video on or off, so that you can be seen or not. And then thirdly, throughout the conversation, you can add your questions in the chat found with the button on the toolbar below, or you can add them in the kind of general chat. During the Q&A, we'll begin with those questions and I'll read them out loud for the recording. You can also use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen to ask your question out loud if you prefer. So, turning back to our conversation, the artists Shellburne Thurber, Avram Finkelstein, and Gail Thacker, who join us, as I mentioned, had works in this exhibition, As the World Burns, Queer Photography and Nightlife. And prior to delving into the panel, I'll just give a brief kind of snippet about the exhibition, which was curated by Jackson. It examined how community photographic practices contributed to queer nightlife and gay liberation in our city of Boston in the 1970s through the early 1990s. Jackson will certainly provide more of an in-depth perspective into the exhibition, but in brief, it offered examinations of the queer press, the Boston School, and nightlife, bringing together the works of many artists, which I'd like to name here just because of their wonderful contributions that we're so proud to exhibit. That includes Craig Bailey, Bobby Busnack and Geraldine Visco, Nick DeWolf, Sherry Edwards, Avram Finkelstein, Alan Frame, Jason Byron Gavon, Patricia A. Gazemba, Jim McGrath, Philin Flash, Angela Russo, Shellburne Thurber, Gail Thacker, and Christian Walker, and finally Mark Weiner. We're extremely grateful for their contributions, and we love to see that this, the legacy of their work continues on in this conversation and certainly beyond it. And so this afternoon, we'll hear much more from Finkelstein, Thacker, and Thurber, so thank you. And now I'll just introduce Jackson Davidow, who will then introduce the exhibition more fully and our speakers. Jackson Davidow is an art historian, curator, and critic. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe Magazine, the Baffler, Boston Review, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and throughout the art press. He is currently working on a book about global AIDS cultural activism. So thank you and welcome, Jackson, whom I will spotlight momentarily.
Great. Firstly, thanks to everyone who made this event possible, particularly Kelly, Laurel, and all of the staff at TUAG. I'm not an alum of Tufts or the SMFA myself, though somehow I feel like an alum. I've worked at the university in various capacities over the years, and I must admit that I have a lot more school spirit here than for any of the other schools I actually went to. So it's an honor to moderate today. Firstly, I'll introduce the exhibition a little bit. As the World Burns, Queer Photography and Nightlife in Boston explored the connections between community photographic practices, queer nightlife, and gay liberation in Boston. In the early 1970s, Greater Boston became an important hub of gay culture, activism, and nightlife, as well as home to a flourishing photo scene. Queer artists and community members turned to photography to chronicle, elevate, and enrich their disparate experiences of nightlife. So I assembled in this exhibition 3 overlapping categories of nightlife photography. It was a non-chronological archive of lesser-known images, collections, and stories that are rarely put together in art history or curatorial practices. Firstly, it was works by photographers involved in teaching and exhibition contexts of fine art, such as the SMFA. Secondly, works by photographers who contributed to the gay press, and thirdly, vernacular works by other community members. Collectively, these works revealed how both nightlife spaces and photographic projects contributed to the production and consolidation of LGBTQ identities and communities in the public realm during a period of tremendous socio-political tumult and transformation. Coming out, going out, photographing, and being photographed were intertwined activities through which new forms of queerness and community became visible. This exhibition, which accompanied Christian Walker, The Profane and the Poignant, which I curated with Noam Parnes, offered a wider historical context for Walker's navigation of gay art and life in Boston. A Black man who lived in the South End in Dorchester from 1974 to 1984, and who went to the museum school in the early 1980s, Walker belonged to multiple gay worlds of photography, activism, publishing, and nightlife. For these reasons, his unique trajectory inspired a wide-ranging curatorial search for photographic histories of local queer nightlife across the realms of fine art, the gay press, and community archives. Queer photography in Boston is often synonymous with a loose circle of fabled artist friends known as the Boston School. This pretentious term was coined ironically by Nan Golden and later embraced by curators Leah Gangitano and Milena Kalinowska in their landmark 1995 exhibition of the same name at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. Many of these so-called Boston School artists, primarily photographers who studied at the SMFA and the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, or Mass Art, in the 1970s and early 1980s, used their experiences of nightlife and sex as raw material for their artistic practices. Although indebted to Gangitano and Kalinowska's theorization of this cultural moment, As the World Burns expanded this now canonical narrative, incorporating and recontextualizing the work of several artists whose names Laurel just read, many of whom, like Christian Walker, were left out of this Boston school history. In so doing, this exhibition traces a wider geography of art education by centering artists who studied at the New England School of Photography, Boston University, Harvard University, and various community centers, as well as those who are self-taught but operated in art worlds. While this exhibition didn't limit itself to the museum school's history, it's truly been a delight to dig into some of the institutional archives here and to familiarize myself with a wider community of students and teachers. In today's panel, there will be space for waxing lyrical about the SMFA as a site of learning, community, and nostalgia, but there will also be space for critical engagement. One of the more sobering things that these histories remind us, for example, is of the whiteness of this institution. Walker, after all, was one of the only Black people on campus when he was a student. And this is a particularly salient topic to discuss right now because of the Supreme Court's deplorable ruling against affirmative action last year. The first-year students of color have declined by 6% this year at Tufts, with the most staggering decrease amongst Black students. In other words, the student body of Tufts is becoming increasingly white, as is that of higher education in the US at large. So with these things in mind, I want to now introduce our wonderful panelists in the order of their presentations, and actually they'll be presenting in reverse chronological order in terms of their attendance at the museum school. Gail Thacker is known for her manipulated and painted Polaroids, part of the Boston School, who I already defined. Thacker studied painting, video, and film at the SMFA in 1982. When she moved to New York, the city was at its most ragged, frayed around the edges and dangerous, and eventually shrouded with a cloud from loss of community to AIDS. Thacker lived among the artistic and theatrical milieu that produced groundbreaking work by artists and creators of all stripes. Next, we'll have Avram Finkelstein, an artist, activist, and writer living in Brooklyn and a founding member of the Silence Equals Death and Grand Fury collectives. He is featured in the American Artist Oral History Project at the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art. His book, After Silence, A History of AIDS Through Its Images, is available through the University of California Press and was nominated for an International Center of Photography's 2018 Infinity Award in Critical Writing and Research and a 30th Annual Lambda Literary Award in LGBT Nonfiction. He has worked in the permanent collections of MoMA, the Whitney, the Metropolitan Museum, the New Museum, the Smithsonian, the Brooklyn Museum, the V&A, and the New York Public Library, and his work has been shown at many other important museums as well. He has had numerous public commissions and residencies at Pioneer Works and the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics. Lastly, we'll have Shellburne Thurber, who graduated from the SMFA and Tufts. Her work has been in numerous group and one-person shows, both here in Boston, in the US and abroad. Her work is in several collections, including the MFA in Boston, the Addison Gallery of American Art, the Worcester Art Museum, and the De Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park. Thurber has taught extensively throughout New England, and most recently is a visiting professor of photography at Mass Art, and was recently awarded a fellowship from the St. Gaudens National Historic Site. So each artist will be making a brief presentation, and then we'll reconvene as a panel. And let me turn it over to Gail.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jackson. And actually, I'll just put on the screen, Gail, your slides. So give me one moment, please.
Okay. While you're doing that, I just want to say hi. I'm Gail. I'm an artist, and I want to thank oh my God. I want to thank everybody for inviting me here today, and I'm really thrilled that I'm sitting here with Avram and Shellburne and Jackson. Jackson, I can see you at the museum school in the 80s. I really can. You would really fit in. Laurel, thank you. Elsie, Kelly. I graduated the museum school through Tufts back in '81, and I got to study over the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which was really interesting. The museum school was rather like just open studies. There was, no rules or regulations. It was incredible. Can I see the first image? Is it up? That's an image of that Mark Morrisroe took, and I kind of think it says so much, because this was an image that's called Blow Both of Us, me and Gail Thacker, but it was originally just Blow Both of Us, and it went along with an exhibition we had. But from the title to the looks on our faces, it kind of really says it all for me. This is a point where life as art kind of opened up in our dialogue with each other, because it was not about living life large in the sense where you're going to have a big house. It was living life large in the point that you were going to do and be and could be anything. And, with this image, we had collaborated with Pat Hearn, who was someone I met at the museum school as well, my first day, and Jeff and Jane Hudson's video class. I managed to break their equipment the first day on my tape loop, but and she turned her loft into a gallery, which was above Cantone's, a club where we also used to frequent. So we were using makeshift spaces for our artwork, because the actual gallery spaces were too conservative. They didn't want anything to do with us. And then the next image is like many years later, skipping over. Can you go to the next image? That's Mark Morrisroe in bed. And the reason this is the height, no, stay up, Mark. This is thank you, dear. Thank you. This is the height of the AIDS epidemic. I bring this up because this was a major influence on my understanding of my work, where suddenly this technique, which was just really cool, suddenly had meaning. It was decay. It was nature. We're all very fragile, and the honeymoon and the joy was over. You have to understand, we just got out of the Vietnam War, and we're sandwiched in that point between the Vietnam War and before the AIDS epidemic was kind of like heaven. It was a lot of bullshit happening, but it was a moment of calm for us at the museum school. Mark ended up passing away at 30 years old, and many other people that this image represents. And it was also, when I asked him if I could take his portrait that day, it was to grab his essence. This was one of the people I considered to be like living life to his fullest, all of a sudden crumbled. So the next image is Rafael Sanchez, a performance artist and an artist. We had experienced Mark's death together, and Mark had gifted me this big box of film. So we kind of created a lifeboat of safety and creativity. And there, I think, as I look back on this, is where I started the dialogue in my work for performance for the camera, where I'm very involved with theater. I owned a theater for many years, and I find that these artists that I am photographing are life is the art, right? Costumes are the art. The presentation of who we are is the art. Okay. And the next image is a self-portrait. And this is Reject. It's a self-portrait. And they did this because as an artist, we all have self-doubt. I had just started painting on my photographs. And I was also shunned by my peers at this point. In the 90s, Mark had just passed away. I felt very alone, and I was not welcomed back until I was a friend of Bill's. And so this is when I started painting with the analog 665. And the next image is of Bobby Hondo, Hondo. She was one of our backstage hands at Paul Alexander's Trinkets at a theater I ran. She represents a lot of the LGBT and trans community that I love and cherish, and also do my best to promote their work at the theater I ran until January of this past year. She committed suicide not too long ago. And that theater is where I took thousands of images of mostly queer artists coming in to the theater to either have their portrait taken by me or express themselves through theater. And I'm not going to say too much more because we have other artists to talk about, but that's who I am. And let's get to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Avram?
Hi, how are you? Can we get that first slide? Not that one, that one. So I come from a very political family, and I was involved in, Gail referenced the Student Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, and I learned how to silkscreen in 1968 at the local Quaker school, remaking French student strike posters. The left image is a reject from my first political poster. When I was deciding on colleges the following year, I visited the museum school, and it had just switched from a classical academy to an experimental program, and it was open 24 hours a day for the student strikes. We walked in the front door, and the first floor studios were filled with students churning out posters for the local demonstrations in Boston, and there were posters drying in the main corridor on either side. So that poster on the right is one of those posters that I rolled up, and I turned to my mother and I said, "This is where I'm going to school," and we went straight to the admissions office. The next image, so soon after moving to Boston, I met David Armstrong. That's the image on the left, a portrait of David by Nan Golden, and he introduced me to his circle of friends, which included his roommate, Nan Golden. On the right is a Christmas card mail art from them when they lived in Central Square, I think. So David told me he wanted to apply to the museum school, and I was on the portfolio review committee and made sure he was admitted. I believe he was on the committee when Nan applied. The next image, I wanted to talk a little bit about this work, which was in the show that Jackson curated. At the same time that Nan was photo documenting our circle of friends, I was making sculptural portraits of them. What you're looking at here is a porcelain portrait of Kenny Angelico as a milk pitcher in drag. And there was a needlepoint I did of another person from our circle of friends that was in Jackson's exhibition. It was a needlepoint portrait of B. Rogers. My first job that I ever got in Boston was through the placement office at the museum school, and it was at the Women's Educational and Industrial Union in the needlepoint shop. And the reason I took the job was they said I could wear women's shoes to work. So the next image is after I moved back to New York, the man I was building my life around began to show signs of immunosuppression in 1981. By 1984, he was dead. So I formed a collective in late 1985 and suggested we make a poster about the politics of AIDS. That's the Silence Equals Death poster on the left. The poster began appearing in New York City a few weeks before the formation of the AIDS activist organization ACT UP. And I chronicle this time in my book for UC Press that David Jackson mentioned, After Silence. That's the book cover on the right. If you're interested in queer life in New York at that point in time, you should probably read this book. My sister says it's a page turner. So the next slide is one location. I was in charge of deciding where we should put those posters, the Silence Equals Death posters up. And I suggested we repaste the Silence Equals Death poster across from the new museum. It caused the head curator to offer the museum windows to ACT UP for an installation, which kickstarted the formation of the Grand Fury Collective, which are the two top rows of images, or Silence Equals Death and Grand Fury work. I did a ton of public projects in New York City with these two collectives, and it spurred a reacquaintance with David and Nan, who had also moved to New York, and I saw socially, but we became closer at that point. The bottom row are images from a story by Nan that I art directed for Visionaire magazine. The next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about my current work. So in the late 1990s, I returned to my solo practice. My increasing disability caused me to rethink my ideas about public spaces as being intrinsically more accessible. The way every social space is simultaneously accessible and restricted has been foregrounded for me. And I've started to think about the activation of social space as perhaps a more accurate measure of accessibility. I'm no longer able to handle paper, so I work on translucent acetate of walls presented as freestanding objects that perform representation as a process informed by the viewer's observation. This installation was about the lack of COVID-19 pandemic preparedness, and it was commissioned by Tinworks Art in Bozeman, Montana. This next installation was commissioned by the New York City AIDS Memorial, and it further explores this strategy. It involved 6 30 by 30-foot long digital prints of drawings of the sky suspended from the structure with silkscreen text by the lesbian poet Irina Klepfitz. The next slide, I've begun to think of art spaces as experiential dance halls in which the viewer and the artist can switch places. So I've also been thinking, because of my critiques of the systems of evaluations that are intrinsic to the art world, I've decided to sort of start showing my drawings as performative wheeled sculptures. The work is drawn on both sides, creating a sort of layered diptych. This double-sided drawing was funded by the Pollock Krausner Foundation and will be featured in the upcoming Brooklyn Artist Show at the Brooklyn Museum, October 4th. The next slide is, it's a rendering of an exhibition that I'm working on now. My current work consists of drawings that may be read as abstractions, but they're actually depictions of microscopic cytology, our internal planetarium. Articulating the body as a system in flux and the objectness of memory. This rendering is for the upcoming show, which will be at Smack Mellon in New York, and it's funded by Creative Capital. And the last image is these are some of the works that will be in the show. One of the 6-foot by 13-foot drawings is photoluminescent, and it will be charged by the light of the setting sun in the gallery space and only visible for a half hour. So I just wanted to bridge the gap between school and what happens after school and talk a little bit about that. And thank you.
Thank you, Avram. Shellburne.
Okay. Mute. Okay. I don't always have this. So we could put up the first image. I got a lot of my practice really began, if you could call it that. I mean, I started taking pictures seriously when I ended up in Saratoga Springs back in the late 60s, and I'd gone to school at Skidmore for about a year, but Skidmore and I didn't get along very well. So I just dropped out and moved into the town, where I met a really interesting group of people, and people that I could, for the first time in my life, actually relate to. And that's where I started photographing my friends, and I'd been photographing my family I'm continue to be very close to. But anyway, so at some point I left Saratoga and moved back to New Hampshire, and a friend of mine who had also been at Skidmore ended up leaving and going to the museum school. And she said, you should really check out the museum school. But at that point, I didn't want to have anything to do with institutions of higher learning. I was like, that 1 year was a disaster, and I'm not going back. I had set up a dark room in my mother's house. She had died a couple of years previously, and I was just ready to hunker down and see what happened. But anyway, I went to the museum school with her one afternoon, and I walked through the doors, and I couldn't believe it. It was kind of complete chaos, and I thought, this is great. This is my home. I'm thrilled to be. So I applied and got in, and it was a very, Gail and Avram and I have talked about this. It was a very special place. I don't think it could exist now, but it was freewheeling, free floating. The guy who ran the place, Bill Bagnell, was just an unbelievable person and a little acerbic. I think he scared a lot of people, but he fought tooth and nail for everyone's artistic integrity and their right to be whoever they wanted to be, which was great. I also loved it because they allowed dogs in the school. So, the place was overrun with dogs, which was kind of great. And anyway, I eventually met Nan in the darkroom one day, and I was in and out of the school. I would attend for a year, and then I'd drop out and waitress to make a little money and then come back. But the museum school allowed you to do that. A lot of the time I was using the darkroom when I wasn't even meant to be there. I mean, it was really kind of great. Anyway, so Bill Burke taught a terrific photo course, and both P.L. DeCorsia and Nan were in that course. And every week we would meet in Bill's loft in JP and look at work and talk. And so Bill became a very good friend. Nan became a very good friend, as did P.L. DeCorsia. I got to know him both through the photo department, but also through his girlfriend, Kathy Zuber, who was in a photo course that I TA'd with Amos Chan on. And so it was also sort of important for me because up until that point, I wasn't really meeting anyone. The primary thing going on in photo at the time was documentary, and there weren't a whole lot of people focusing on their community and their intimate relationships. So I felt like I had found my family in more ways than one. That having been said, I'm very, because in large part because my mother died so young, I was very close to my brothers. So through them, I was connected with other communities in Boston, primarily the music community. So this is a picture of Bill and Nan who was wearing my slip. I don't know where she got my slip from, but anyway, and I think it was my birthday, and that's actually Kenny, whom Avram has mentioned, coming in on the right. We can go to the next one. So that's Kathy Zuber, PL DeCorsh's girlfriend, and me in my car, and my dog, Logue, who spent a lot of time at the museum school. I think he and Bill Burke's dog, Ralph, used to fight all the time. I can't remember. Anyway, next. And that's a picture of Nan, the young Nan in Boston. Next. And once again, Kenny was oh, I should tell the story about Kenny because this is really interesting. One of the places I used to like to go to when I was at the museum school, which was the other side, which is a drag bar, and I just loved it. And I especially went because there was a drag queen that I'd kind of fallen for, and this drag queen was classy, only showed up in Chanel, I mean, or other designer. You know, the others were into the boa and the, you know, the sprinkle and all that stuff, but this drag queen was, and so I found myself going just to look at them and see what they were coming up with for for outfits. And anyway, so then flash forward a couple of years, and Nan invites me over to her apartment, and I meet her roommate, and he invites me into his bedroom, and he had an amazing collection of stuff. He had a collection of Victorian miniature, like very dark miniature Victorian paintings, and Chinese bound shoes, and a collection of very small Victorian frames. And in one of them was Ivy, the drag queen that I'd kind of fallen for. And I turned to Kenny and I said, wow, do you know that person? And he got kind of embarrassed. He said, that's me. And I thought, this is great. So anyway, Kenny became a really good friend. He was a hair cutter, but also a remarkable clothing designer. And so we became fast and furious friends. And he became one of those people, along with my family and many of my close friends, that I photographed a lot. Next. So that's Kenny in front of the Copley Plaza. I think that was the outfit he used to cut hair in. The next, that's another one of him, same day, color. Next. And at that point, I was starting to work a lot. I had been influenced by both. When I first started out, I was looking at fashion magazines. I loved fashion magazines, and specifically people like Penn and Avedon, early Avedon, not later Avedon. And also Bill Burke was using the Polaroid camera, not the big one, but using Polaroid film to make a lot of his images. And so I had gotten some film from the Polaroid Corporation to make work. And this is one of them. This is Kenny and one of the outfits that he designed. Next. And this is and so we used to photograph each other all the time, me and Nan and PL. And this is as a matter of fact, I think that picture of me with Kathy and my dog was probably either taken by PL or taken by Bill. I'm not sure which, but this is a picture that Nan took of me with my cat. And this last, I believe this is the last one. This is a picture that I took of Kenny that I've always particularly liked. And like so many others that I knew, he died too young. And I think I agree with everything Gail has said and Avram has said, that there was this very brief period of time where we were all, I mean, the Vietnam War was horrendous. I mean, so many people I knew were in line to get shipped off. I mean, the draft was active, and that was really tough. And getting past that was huge. We also had Stonewall and the women's movement and the civil rights movement. So there was that period of time where things seemed like, okay, settling down here. And then AIDS. And the fact that nobody would pay attention. So that's my story.
Thank you, Shellburne. And just briefly, I wanted to note that the milk sculpture that Avram showed, the muse for that was actually Kenny/Ivy, who Shellburne is showing us right now. It's the same person. So thank you, all three of you, for these wonderful, really rich and provocative presentations. I think that one thing that they clarified for me was that though you all went to the same school, you had very different artistic practices, very different multidisciplinary trajectories. And they also underscored the ways in which perhaps the SMFA couldn't exist today as it did back then in the 1970s and early 1980s. One thing that I'd like to hear more about is how you navigated the school as a place of learning, as a place of art making, and also as a social world. And not just the SMFA, but the city of Boston. I'd like to hear more about the art school's relationship to the broader city, to the broader constellation of communities that you were encountering in your everyday lives.
I can
It's-
think.
Go ahead.
Okay. I know with me, that is, it was kind of ricocheting off the museum school, because the museum school is where I met everyone, like Mark and Pat. And then we would go to a club and meet another person, or a bar, or even sitting at Friendly's. We met Steve Stain, who had used to run 38 Thayer Street, which was a warehouse where people like George Condo, the Girls, Mission of Burma, a lot of interesting things were happening over there. But then in the museum school is where you did your painting and your photography, but then you had to go all the way to MIT to do your video, and then you had to go all the way to Tufts to do your academics. So it was a lot of bus taking and walking. Like, I don't know how the museum school is today, whether you still have to go to Tufts for your academics. Do you?
Yeah, they're even more entangled today because Tufts owns the museum school.
So why don't they set up the academics over there? I always wished that they had like art criticism there, and something to anyhow, but let me manage the place. But okay, that's it.
As Shellburne and I were gossiping before we began today about what the museum school was like then, and people, because it was open 24 hours a day and it was a very experimental program and self-directed, there were people sleeping in the gallery right as you walked inside the door. There were dogs, it was wild and very experimental. And I think for people who were self-directed, it was probably great, but there were people who were literally walking into walls because they didn't know who the teachers were and they didn't know what was expected of them. And then there were people who really thrived in that environment.
Yeah, Avram, actually, you've of course told me about your specific pathway through the institution, but it is kind of illuminating as far as how a lot of students were ping-ponging back and forth across departments. Do you want to say more about that experience?
Yeah, I think that's again the Boston School as photography didn't really exist at the point I was there, and I think it's also I was there 2 years after Stonewall, so it was a very queer place in every aspect. But we didn't think of it that way. We didn't have that set of that frame for it. And also, since it was so encouraging of experimentation, I started out as a film major. I knew Bill Burke, but film was too expensive for me. So right across the hall was the printmaking department, and I switched to lithography. The stones were heavy. It was too arduous. I kind of hated it. And right next to the next door to the print studio was the ceramic studio. And Bill Wyman was heading the department at that point in time. And there were always peals of wild laughter coming from the back room of the ceramics department. It was kind of like the lunatic fringe. In the rest of the ceramic studio, people were throwing on the wheel and they were making pots. And in the back, everyone who was experimenting with the form was sort of relegated to that back room. And that became my closest circle of friends. And that's how I ended up doing ceramics. I had no interest in making pots. The portrait of Kenny is a critique of the functionality of ceramics and the balancing act between function and identity that was being called into question in queer communities at that point in time, which is how I ended up making ceramic and needlepoint portraits of the same people that Nan and Shellburne and PL were photographing.
Yeah, do you want to say more about how you brought together these different art forms and even just going to MIT to study film and video? What was that like, and how seamlessly were you able to incorporate those forms into your practice back then?
Well, I just have to say one thing before I say that is that Shellburne, Avram, by the time I got there, you guys were like these shadows of like hovering over us with reputation of things you had done. And, you know, because I'm sure it's like that for other students as well, because I found that I learned a lot from other students, from the other people. Those were the people I was showing my work to. You know, the review boards, I think I used to bring 2 pieces. It was so funny. I sent away for Mark's review board, Pat's review board, and mine. Mark, oh, excellent student. He will go far. Pat, oh, praised her. Mine, they were like, she just wants to hang around with her friends. And they were right. You know, I did just want to hang around with my friends. It was a lot, but going to MIT was such a wonderful experience. I was so glad that the museum school allowed us to do that. And I think Pat and I were the 2nd and 3rd student from the program to actually go there. There was another student, I don't remember her name, she had red hair, that's all I remember. Because they had state-of-the-art equipment and they were having conversations that were big, like about space and community and global villages and things that we weren't talking about at the museum school. So it was really interesting, and Ricky Leacock was there. So I didn't mind taking the bus up Mass Ave over to MIT. I loved it, but it could be MIT or the museum school. It was very difficult to do both and to be at both places. So when I left the video, because I would have to go back to the video department to Jeff and Jane Hudson to show them my videos that I was working at there. But I would get really shy and not show them, you know, because they weren't part of my world, you know, I had not opened up to them. And yeah, anyhow, but going to Medford, that was a pain in the butt, but it was a real pain in the butt, I must admit. But I did it, right? I did it. Because when you're 20, you do anything.
Well, the students still do it today. So
Yeah.
Alone. Let's see. I was wondering, Shellburne, especially since you've been you know, an educator, a photography professor in the Boston area for decades, you know, mainly at Mass Art. Could you say more about the review board structure at the SMFA and how unique it was and how it opened up something new for a lot of people?
I can. I mean, I also want to mention that one of the reasons why I left Skidmore, I had gone to Skidmore. I had wanted to go to an art school, but at that point, and I actually had wanted to go out to California, but my mother was dying at the time and didn't want me so far away. So I thought, well, go to Skidmore. They've got a good art department and, you know, whatever. But the art department was all the faculty, and this is why I'm bringing it up. They were all male, all Yale educated, and they were really only interested in one thing. It was an all-women's school, so I don't think I have to go any further. I mean, it was just really obnoxious, and I couldn't take it. So when I got to the museum school and everything was so freewheeling, and and everyone was kind of taken seriously if they wanted to be taken seriously, or as Avram described, you could kind of fall into the shadows and get a little bit lost. But the review board system was so great because you weren't being given grades. You were it was actually it was a time to discuss your work with your fellow students and the professors who were running the review board, which was terrific. And I don't know any other. I'm sure maybe there were other schools in the country that were doing that. I don't know, Avram, do you think so?
I'm not so sure, but I will say something about the portfolio review committee and the review boards were equal parts instructors and students. So everything about the structure of the school was egalitarian and based on the vision, the shared vision. And Shellburne and I were gossiping before you all joined us. I don't know how people afford to go to school now. It was $3,000 a year. It was a big deal for my family. So because of the review board system, I went to school during the height of situationism and was very influenced by anti-art and started destroying my own work as a part of my practice. And I got a year's extra credit for that work, which enabled me to take an accelerated course at Tufts and graduate a year early because it was just too expensive. I don't know that I would have been able to stay in school if it hadn't been for the review board program. I showed shards of an entire semester's work. I had one example of each idea that I was working on. In fact, I destroyed most of the work and gave those portraits. I did a portrait of B, of David Armstrong. I gave them my portraits of them and destroyed the work. And that particular work was taken by another classmate of ours. And when I found out about it, I was like, can I borrow it for the show? So I think the review boards were an essential part of the way we thought about developing a practice. And I agree, Shellburne. I don't know if other schools necessarily give you that same sense of yourself in relation to your practice.
And also you could, I mean, I landed in the photo department when I first got there, but I quickly moved on. I went into the film department, I went into graphic design, I went into printmaking, I think the only thing that I didn't go into was probably ceramics and sculpture, always being kind of 2D, but nobody, you didn't, it was so unstructured. But for those of us who really, I could no more have gone to a more structured place. I just wouldn't have gone. I mean, so that was pretty terrific.
I can't help but say, Avram, did you get extra credit after you destroyed the work or before you destroyed the work?
So for that review board, I was explaining to them my whole theory of when I was a kid, the Mona Lisa was loaned by the Louvre to the Metropolitan Museum, and I was dragged on a school trip to see the Mona Lisa. And there was a line, and I could see it across the gallery, and it was brown, and I didn't know if I even liked it. We were ushered past it, and by the time I went to art school, because there were such long lines, we had 30 seconds in front of the painting. And So when I went to the museum school, I was thinking a lot about that and thinking, if I had known the Mona Lisa was going to be incinerated the second I left the gallery, would I have paid more attention to it? Would I have had an honest experience of it? And that's when I began to think about the objectness, systems evaluation, and the destruction of my work was very much part of the practice. So I I did a series of loving cups for imaginary sport events that were all meant to reify maleness. I did another series of portraits of transgendered people. And I saved one from each group that I was working on, and I destroyed everything else. And I showed piles of broken work, and one example of this and one example of that.
That answers my question. Okay, so you showed some piles of broken work. Wonderful. Wonderful. Love that.
In
know,
fact,
It's a miracle that these works still exist, the portraits of Bee and Kenny, because they were able to appear in the exhibition.
in fact, the works that I did keep whole for the review board, after the review board, I went right into the hallway and started smashing them in the trash can on the main floor. And somebody called the school psychologist on after me, thinking I was having a nervous episode. And he came over and he said, Avram, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, John. And I'm like smashing the pots as I'm talking to him.
I remember John. Yeah.
John Bayless.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask how your art in queer circles and perhaps these alum networks transformed as you graduated, and in the case of Avram and Gail, moved to New York City.
Avram, you want to go first?
Well, I told you a little bit about it. I mean, David and myself, a whole bunch of people moved to New York. I saw them socially, but didn't become reacquainted with them until the March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights in Washington, D.C. And ACT UP had all of these posters that I had done. So I was marching with ACT UP and I heard my name being screamed. And it was Nan and David, and they're like waving. So we became reacquainted in a different way around the question of queerness and survival and identity at that point in time.
Okay. Me moving to New York. I moved there a little bit before Mark and Pat, and things started to get a little different because we were all doing separate things, still friends. A lot of I became more like it took time for us to grow back together. But my friendship with Mark never failed. It didn't matter what I did. Mark would gossip about me because that's just his nature, because I would make for a good story. But he was always there for me. And Pat was too, to a point. But the group that we had in Boston turned into something else, because some people were still in Boston, some people moved to LA. It had broken up, and it was a large group of people. You know, there were people from Mass Art, there were people that didn't go to school, and we were just all, you know, together, you know, making a scene.
Gail, can you briefly explain to the audience who Pat Hearn was and what she did in New York?
Pat Hearn was owned the Pat Hearn Gallery in New York City. And she was probably one of the most important gallery owners, became one of the most important gallery owners and influential gallery owners of New York City. When she was in the Lower East Side, everybody else went to the Lower East Side. When she went to Soho, everybody else went to Soho. When she went to Chelsea, everybody followed her to Chelsea. Andy Warhol did her portrait. She was big, like I talk about these people, these artists are just larger than life. They have this energy about them that it just comes off them when they walk in the room. They don't have to say a word. And Pat was very, she was an exaggeration of a human being when she first got there, with the sweeps of eyeliner and the big bouffant hairs and the wild costumes. And she was very smart as well. She knew what she was doing. And she blossomed into an incredible professional from these wild kids. We were at the museum school and we were wild. We tried to outdo each other on everything, from extremely strange life things. And when Mark moved to New York City and I went to go visit him, he was living in Jersey, and he was mock dirt at the museum school. And I said something about on his address, mock dirt, blah, 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 blah. He goes, Gail, I'm not mock dirt anymore. And I said, whatever, what are you? And he's like, Mark Morris wrote, I'm a professional now. He changed. Everybody changed when they moved to New York City. Everybody, this was our dream. We all wanted to be successful. We all wanted to work hard on our work. We wanted to be part of the things we read about. We wanted to make that, not just like watch, but make it. And they did, and we did. You just keep going. You just keep doing it. So yeah, that's what moving to New York did.
Shellburne, of course, you went to New York quite a lot. You exhibited there. You were in Nan Goldin's exhibition Against Our Vanishing, or Witnesses Against Our Vanishing at Artist Space in 1989, for example. But can you say more about what it was like to remain in Boston and how this reconfigured itself, over the decades?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that I felt a little lost initially when everyone left. But I think it's important to understand that my connection with my brothers is very, very strong. And they all remained here. And I really remained here because I wanted to be with my family. And I'd also gotten involved in all these other things. I mean, through my brothers, who were all musicians, I was actively involved in the music community. I was also involved at the theater. There was a really strong alternative theater community here. And so I'm also, by nature, I'm a Yankee. What can I say? And that doesn't get driven out of you all that easily, and I think that I loved going to New York to visit, but I think being somebody who needs a lot of quiet space, probably New York was not the right place for me. And so I kind of stuck around and just sort of fell into other communities when there was a Camelot period at the ICA, which was pretty terrific, when Milena Kalinowska came on board and Leah Gangitano, who started off as a registrar and eventually became a curator. I mean, there were a whole group of people that I got to know around the ICA who sort of resurrected this feeling that I had had when all my museum school friends were remaining in Boston. So I think that what happened for me was all my friends took off for New York, but then I had my brothers in the music scene, which kept me here. And I continued to photograph. I was just photographing all those people, but people would come back to visit. Nan's family lived in Swampscott, so she was back a lot. Kenny, Kenny stuck around actually a little bit longer than I think everyone else did. And so he and I ended up hanging out together a lot. And then I would go to New York, and it's Yeah, so it wasn't, but it was initially a little strange. You know, I felt a little left behind, but that was my choice. You know, it really wasn't, I think, for any number of reasons, an option for me. So, and I do, and I do better. And I mean, Boston's not New Hampshire. I could have gone back to New Hampshire. It's-
That's true.
I have to say, being from New York, when I decided to move back, and the only reason I decided to move back was the busing crisis, and I was living on Mission Hill, and they were throwing rocks at the school buses, and I was like, "Get me out of here!" And when I was going back to New York, everyone in Boston was saying, "Oh, they're going to gun you down in the streets, and it's a horrible place to live." And if you're from New York, it's like a small town. It's just that's how every place that you grow up, that's how you think of it.
yeah, I loved going to visit, and I had a place to stay. I could hang out with Nan and her crazy scenes. So that was also, I think David was around here for a while.
Well, I think he and Dan moved down around the same time. I thought he lived on Elizabeth Street, and Kenny moved in, was staying with Nan on the Bowery.
That's right. Yeah, I've
Wow.
got some pictures of Nan and Kenny, and you remember Janet Stein?
Of course.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
out with
photo was in our exhibition.
what?
There, one of Shellburne's pictures was of that night, of one night was in the exhibition.
That was beautiful.
So at this point, I think it makes sense to perhaps open up the conversation and to see if the audience members have questions. And I think, Laurel, correct me if I'm wrong, people can raise their hands, and then they can either type things into the chat, or they can elect to unmute themselves and to say something on video.
That's correct. Thanks, Jackson. And I'm going to stop the share with the images for now, just to have us all on screen. But yes, feel free, anyone, if you'd like to raise your hand and ask a question or add them in the chat. I can certainly start us off with a question if folks need time to kind of think. All right, I'm going to do that. I have heard many amazing stories in this conversation, but also from many folks that came and attended the opening reception for As the World Burns, and also artists who were within the SMFA communities and outside of them. I know that there was a lot of interaction between Greater Boston audiences and the SMFA, so I'm very curious about that dialogue, perhaps events that took place at the SMFA that included external members. And I've heard that these events could have been wild and well received by the public. So I'm curious about the activities there that brought those two communities together, perhaps that you can recall during your time, and maybe some of you were a part of them.
So I was in that student faculty show I was talking about, and Jay Jaroslav was in it, and I had sent a bunch of these portraits to that show, and one of them was, instead of being glazed, it was covered in opalescent lipstick, and some of the ones you saw have feathers and rhinestones on them, and one of them was completely full of Vaseline, and I think whoever did the installation thought it was a mistake and cleaned the Vaseline out, and there Nan and I are at the opening, and I'm like, holy, can I curse? I have a bad I'm like, she's like, let's go to Phillips drugstore and get some more Vaseline. So the two of us went and got a tub of Vaseline, and I put it in my jacket pocket, and the two of us are like slathering the inside of the pot with Vaseline. I think everything about it was really wild, and there are stories I can't really share, but it was wild. I think it was.
I don't really remember. I mean, I'm trying to.
Did you guys know Jeff and Jane Hudson out of the video department?
Of course, I knew.
Oh,
what
yeah.
they
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
Oh my God, they had like a band called the Rentals, and it
The
was
Rentals, yeah.
and what was it? What was the drummer's name? What was the drummer's name? Pseudo Carol.
I
Pseudo
remember.
Yeah, that's right. No, you've got
Uh,
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
on you, Markham. Yeah, we used to go follow them around. From the museum, the students would go, and it was the days of punk rock. We'd go to the Rat Skeller. I went over to the Rat when I came to visit the exhibition, and I think it's a restaurant now.
What was that? There was a men's bar in the downtown, the financial district, that was like an old school Boston men's bar during the day and turned into a punk club at night.
Playland?
No, it
No,
was, I can't think of the name of it.
my brothers would know. I
The
should.
financial district.
Yeah, in the financial district.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun. I think kind of like
No, it wasn't Club Cafe or Trophy Room. The
Oh,
Club Cafe has been around for a while. So I'm just looking at the chat. It looks like Chris has a question. Would you like to pose it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'm a current grad student at SMFA, and I had the opportunity to go to Switzerland earlier this year and view the Mark Morrisroe archives at the Photo Museum there. And it made me think, and there were a lot of choices made by curators because of just sort of the way that they happened upon the archive. First Mark gave it to Pat, and then Pat passed away. And so when it ended up in their hands, they have to make a lot of decisions about like which print is the one that Mark would have wanted shown, and which print or which take is sort of the one that was the right one. And even in categorizing like where the work stood chronologically, they had to make some decisions. Like they were analyzing who was in the photos to see what was the student work and what was later work. And so it made me think a lot about my own archive and how I'm organizing it. And I'm wondering if I want to know how and if you're thinking about your own archives, because this is really important material that you all created.
Avram and I are working on the exact same thing right now.
Me too.
That's those flat files you see in the back.
Yeah, it makes me nervous. The whole topic makes me nervous.
Yeah, I keep saying I'm doing it, but I haven't.
I know. Finally getting something to help me. It just makes I just worry about it landing in the trash. I don't,
But that's exactly what will happen. And I think that Chris's question is a really good one. I think in a way we have a responsibility to organize the work so that so the Rolling Stones hired Robert Frank to do a film about them.
Right.
And while he was on the plane going from someplace to another, he's flipping through a scrapbook of his and pointing at everything in every picture in it and saying, this is the house I was raised in, this is my friend, blah, blah, blah. I feel like there are a million ways that archiving can be done. And I feel like, having been through the AIDS crisis, people's families don't know what they're looking at after you're gone. And stuff will end up in the trash. And I think we have a responsibility in a way to archive our work.
I was talking to, because my Elsa Dorfman was a really good friend of mine, and she lived down the street. And at one point I was having breakfast with her husband, Harvey, and Harvey said, he just started to lecture me a little bit. And he said, get it done now. He said, Elsa, fortunately she was well enough, she had a place to put all her work, but he said, you do not want to leave it until the last minute. And I think he was sort of stuck with some of it, but fortunately they had people that Elsa had worked with who could help out. But yeah, no, I think it's very important, and I don't think you could start too soon, honestly.
And I think every archive is important. It's not particular archives that are more important. If
Yeah,
you are making work, you're making it as a reflection of a moment in time or a world. That's what archives are for. So I think everyone has an archive and is responsible for it.
You know, my stepmother has been spending the better part of the last 15 years really archiving the history of our family. She has an entire wall full of identical black leather books. And it starts from, I mean, it's unbelievable. I look at this and I think I should hire my 92-year-old stepmother to come into my studio and do the same thing for me. But I agree with Avram. It's all history is important. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Talk about Mark's work over at the photo museum. You know, when I went to go see his work and the little Polaroids, right? They have the actual Polaroids because when they're not coated, they shine gold and silver and these pretty colors. And I realized what they made copies of them and put them, oh God, I'm losing you. They made copies of them. So you don't get to see that quality. You would have to go, you know, make an appointment with the librarian there, I guess, to get to see them. I just wanted to let you know that.
Well, they're so fragile, and that color distortion, that means that they're degrading, right?
Oh, yeah. That's what we all do. Yeah, I love that. I love that.
That's so fascinating.
I see a really terrific question from the chat. It says, what do you all think of the current state of intergenerational queer community or lack thereof, and how can that be fostered and encouraged?
Intergenerational queer community. You mean all of us together?
Sure.
Intergenerational.
I think the point of the question is, you know, what are some platforms or opportunities for intergenerational queer discussion and contact and intimacy? And maybe art and archives are one site where that can manifest.
Right. Well, I'm looking for an assistant if anybody wants to come help, but you know,
Shellburne's mother-in-law.
I just know that it's hard. I feel like a wolf most of the time. You know, where is the support communities? You know, where are the opportunities? Where is everybody? You know, where did they go? It's different times now. You know, it just really is. I think because information has become so easy on this phone I'm sitting on right now, and I can sit around and talk to you on it. I'm not throwing rocks at your window, trying to get your keys to come in. And so I just don't know. How about you guys?
Well, I'm associated with the Queer Art Mentorship Program, which was started by the filmmaker Ira Sachs, and for exactly this reason of like community and the big break between people who artists who died of AIDS or queer activists who died of AIDS and younger queer artists and activists. So it's intergenerational. It's artists are paired with fellows.
Okay.
People apply for it. It's a very vibrant queer community. I have curated 2 or 3 shows over the last 5 or 6 years, and half of the people in the shows are from the Queer Art Mentorship Program.
Oh, please,
So,
I'd love to help.
well, it's also, it used to be only for New York, but now because of Zoom, you can apply for it as a fellow or as a mentor, no matter where you live. So I think for students who are interested, you should look into it. Queer Art Mentorship. I think every queer artist in New York has passed through those doors in one way or another.
Any other thoughts? It looks like Shellburne has something to say.
No, I don't know.
I think I was going to say something like, I think intergenerational queer engagement looks different in New York than it does in Boston. That's just my own experience, though. And I think a lot of my curatorial and intellectual projects are guided by a desire for greater intergenerational queer discourse, specifically in Boston. And certainly these two exhibitions are evidence of that. Another question.
Has settled for generational anything,
Yeah, well, yeah. And I think the evaporation of nightlife spaces too, as well as art spaces, has played a role in these major shifts that have taken place across public and private cultures. I wanted to ask another question. We only have a few minutes left. That is from another student at the SMFA. It says, what advice might you have for current and particularly queer students at the SMFA to make the most of our time and community here?
Talk to people, collaborate.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, but put it out there that you want to get together. And yeah, I like that idea. Yeah, collaborating on projects. I think
that's what brought me close to people.
Yeah.
Is to get, because we were working on projects together. And art was the most important thing in our life.
And I also think something as simple as identifying community and then making a point of, I mean, as dull as it sounds, I mean, getting together every week or, setting up some kind of very concrete framework for getting together and talking about work. I think it's important, talking about your work, which I think is pivotal.
Can I ask a question? I know when I was at the museum school, like it felt like everybody was queer, it's just like it wasn't even thought of, like, will you sleep with me? What's it like there now? Is it because people have more of a vocabulary now? And what is it like? Are queer students being alienated? What's going on?
Does someone from the audience perhaps want to?
It's really, really, really queer. Everyone's gay here. This is a class of gay people right now. We're in a class called non-binary objecthood.
Thank you. Glad to hear that.
Okay, so it sounds like some things haven't changed that much.
Nope. Just the vocabulary.
And there's another question here too, from that same class. Did we read the second part of it too?
No. Do you want to read it, Laura?
Sure. The SMFA has mellowed out from what you've spoken of, having been wild and political. Do you have any advice on how to combat the ways the school can constrain us?
So I think going back to the idea of forming some sort of a collective is one way to do it. So the Silence Equals Death Poster was a men's group that was organized based on feminist organizing, consciousness raising organizing principles. So I think it's possible that group was not designed as an art collective. It wasn't meant to be an art collective. It led to the production of that poster. So I think we're trained in capitalism to think that large groups of people and movements are what changed the world. Individuals change the world. Large groups of people and activist movements are made up of individuals. So I don't think you can ever disregard the power of the individual voice or even tiny collectives. And you don't know where they're going to lead. I think it's really essential to pierce through this sort of capitalist idea of productivity and ways in which we gauge meaning and think draw it much tighter. Like the question of whether which print of Marx he would have approved. I didn't know him very well, but I don't think he would have given a shit about which print, right?
Come
Yeah.
on. Come on. Yeah. I
Well-
also want to add something to what Avram said, that I think that we're living at a time where it's important, regardless of who you are or how you identify, that we make contact and reach out to each other. I think it's really, really important. And I don't know whether I can add to that, but I feel that the tendency, especially with all this technology and what Gail was talking about with the phone, it has the effect oftentimes of separating us. And I don't think COVID helped. And I don't like the fact that we are so physically apart so much of the time.
Wow. You know, think about it. It's like we went to the museum school like literally in a different century, you know, the last century. Okay. And it was very different in the last century. I can't believe I am alive saying these words in the 21st century. This is so beautiful. So I think what you have in your environment as students at the school now, it's like, you know, the answer to that question. You know, you just have to be bold. You just have to be bold and courageous and just take it. But because
did you want to finish that, Gail?
that was a thought. I didn't finish.
It was a beautiful thought.
It was a beautiful thought, and I think unfortunately it's time to wrap up now. I want to thank you, Gail, Avram, and Shellburne, for your tremendously rich reflections today. They certainly will stay with me. Personally speaking, it's been such a dream to work with each of you on this exhibition, and I know that we'll all look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all for coming today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I don't know if Laurel has some concluding remarks.
I do, just to echo the thanks that you've shared, Jackson. It's been truly an immense pleasure to work with you throughout this exhibition and even continued until now. So I've learned so much from you, and I'm very grateful for the collaboration. And Shellburne, Avram, and Gail, thank you for your work. It's important. And I just want to echo something that Jamison Johnson, who is the editor of Boston Art Review, dropped in the chat before she had to run to another meeting. She said, you all are a gift to Boston's cultural community, which is really, truly, you know, that's just honest. And she said, if you can, please, please, please write these stories down. These histories are ones that we cannot afford to lose. So I just wanted to let that sit with you all. We're really grateful that you could join us here today and speak to, you know, audiences from SMFA past and present. So I also want to just share with our audiences that we have current shows on view right now as well. We have a show with Ulysses Collective based out of Philadelphia. They are a print and curatorial collective, and that will be on view through November 10th. We also have an exhibition of the work of Tamashi Jackson on view at our other location in Medford on the main campus, and that will have an opening public reception on September 18th, next week on Wednesday from 6 to 8. So please join us, and I'm going to drop in the chat the rest of our events for this fall season, and I'd welcome you to join us. The programs are always free and open to the public. So once again, thank you. And if you want to share the clap emoji, we'll take it for these wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone.